From Diamond Pharmacy Services, this is PodcastRx. On this late summer episode, Chris Bender of the Optics Clinical Pharmacy team sheds light, sunlight in particular, on drug-induced photosensitivity. He breaks down phototoxicity and photoallergy and how exactly the sun causes these conditions. He also cites the most common medications susceptible to photosensitivity and talks about treatment. We also discuss the relationship between drugs and heat-related illness, how drugs impair thermoregulation, and what medications are prone to heat risk. Grab a cool beverage for this one. Welcome to PodcastRx. I'm Adam Campbell. You want to talk about a ray of sunshine? I'm happy to welcome back Mr. Reliable, Mr. Affable, Chris Bender from the Optics Clinical team back to PodcastRx again. Chris, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good, Adam. Thanks for having me back today. It's good to see that some of the rain clouds have passed and some sun has actually peeked through, which is kind of appropriate for our conversation today. So I'm always glad to be here with you.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely appropriate for our conversation today. You know, Chris, we're in the midst of the dog days of summer as we're recording this July 25th. And it's the perfect time then to talk about a very practical, maybe overlooked pharmacy care topic, and that's the effect of sun on medication. From a more technical point of view, I'm referring to drug-induced photosensitivity, and there are two types of photosensitivity: photoallergy and phototoxicity. So, Chris, just to get this thing started, can you break down the tenets of drug-induced photosensitivity for us?
Yeah, sure thing. So drug-induced photosensitivity is basically this process where certain drugs, when they're either ingested by the mouth or they're applied directly to the skin, they predispose individuals to skin reactions whenever they're exposed to sunlight. And as you had already mentioned, photosensitivity can be broken down into one of two types. We have phototoxicity as well as photoallergy. So phototoxicity is the more common of the two, and it's probably easiest to think of it as a situation where the drug and the sun are kind of teaming up together to cause the skin damage, ultimately leading to what looks like an overly exaggerated sunburn. Now, one key distinction here is that phototoxicity usually appears within hours of sun exposure, so it's very quick and can even occur after just the first dose of a drug. Now, photoallergy, on the other hand, is more of a situation where the body has an allergic skin reaction to a drug in response to sunlight. So because the process is immune-driven, photoallergy doesn't develop as quickly as phototoxicity. It can take days, and it requires a previous exposure to that drug. So it can't happen with the first dose of a drug like we see with phototoxicity. And what's more is that the type of rash that photoallergy creates actually differs slightly as well. So remember, I had said phototoxicity appears more like an exaggerated sunburn, whereas photoallergy looks more like a sunburn, but it also has bumps and blisters associated with it as well. Now, another distinction between the two is that phototoxicity only occurs in the sun-exposed areas. It's a very targeted, very limited area, whereas photoallergy, because it's an immune-driven response, it's more of an imperfect response. It can actually spread to other areas of exposed skin. Or areas of unexposed skin, because the immune cells are just kind of like floating everywhere throughout the skin. Photoallergy is just a note about photoallergy. Photoallergy is most commonly seen with the use of drugs that are applied directly to the skin, whereas phototoxicity we tend to think of more as like occurring with medications that you take orally.
Now, Chris, a point of clarification here. Are the symptoms that you just described the absolute worst, quote unquote, that can happen during a phototoxic or photoallergic reaction? These words toxic and allergy, are often associated with much worse outcomes. And, especially with me, I'm a food allergy dad, as we've talked about on the show before. So when I think any time of allergic reaction, I'm so, always thinking about anaphylaxis. But are we talking about strictly a topical phenomenon when we're talking about phototoxicity and photoallergy?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are thinking more of like a topical reaction. So you're not going to have any sort of like laryngeal or throat involvement. That more of like when you typically think of like an anaphylaxis reaction, you think of more of like a respiratory type of situation. This type of situation, like a photoallergy, is more of a limited topical limited to the skin type of reaction. Now, that's not to say that it, I guess, theoretically couldn't be more severe. Anytime you think about
Hmm.
a very, very bad sunburn with blisters and everything like that, your body can lose a lot of moisture. So
Right.
you could predispose yourself to some dehydration. Um, and anytime you get more severe burns, that can be a more severe situation. But it's not typically a life-threatening type of situation. It's more or less just a like a management kind of thing, manage the burn
Right.
kind of
Right.
situation.
Yeah, not an acute care situation. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So with all that in mind, then how exactly does the sun influence these medications and lead to photosensitivity? What are some of the biochemical reasons or mechanisms behind it?
Yeah, it seems kind of cool. It seems kind of odd, to think that the sun, this external source, can impact
Hmm.
something that is happening internally in your body. So it's kind of a wild concept, but it's important first to understand that any of our drugs, any of our medications, they're ultimately just chemical structures, right?
Hmm.
And some drugs have portions of their chemical structures that are considered to be photoreactive. Now, when we say that something is photoreactive, it basically just means that its chemical structure can change when it's been exposed to the ultraviolet light that we find in sunlight. So, when you take a drug by mouth, in many cases, that drug gets absorbed all throughout the body. And in many cases, it can be found in high enough concentrations in the skin to where it can actually interact with the UVA rays that penetrate deeper into your skin. So, in the case of phototoxicity reactions, when a photoreactive medication is present in the skin, the UVA rays from the sun can change that chemical in a way that creates free radicals in the skin. And I'm sure many of our listeners have heard the term free radicals throughout pop culture, throughout the media. Typically, we come to understand that free radicals, in at least in some way, shape, or form, tend to be not so good for us. So and free radicals are responsible in this case for causing damage to nearby cells, or in this case, the skin cells. So just for reference, hydrogen peroxide is actually a common, albeit somewhat weaker, free radical. So anybody who's had hydrogen peroxide poured into a cut, you can certainly imagine the effect of something like that it could have just floating around in the skin, causing irritation, causing damage to those cells. Um,
A complete aside just for a second,
yeah,
Chris, is that something that's even recommended nowadays with hydrogen peroxide to do that on cuts?
uh,
I was just
yeah. We don't do the hydrogen peroxide stuff anymore. It's just basically
okay.
general cleaning.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because
I'm sorry.
because like no, it's a great point because like I said, hydrogen peroxide can actually be more damaging to the
Hmm.
healthy tissue in a cut than anything else. So
Right.
it was originally thought that it would kill all of the bad stuff in that cut, like the bacteria and stuff like that. But you're actually causing a bit more collateral damage that way as well.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean that brings, that kind of like drives home the point. We don't want those, free radical things floating around in your skin or, anywhere that
Hmm.
could potentially damage cells. So now similarly, in the case of a photoallergic reaction, a photoreactive medication is changed by the UVA rays from the sun. But in this case, rather than turning into a chemical that causes direct cellular damage, it turns into a chemical that triggers the immune system. So the immune system reacts in the same way that it would to any type of allergen by getting red, itchy, and blistering. And this is actually the same as type of reaction as what you'd see with a reaction to something like poison ivy.
Well, now that we understand what it looks like, take us through some of the most common medications that cause this photosensitivity.
So I think it might surprise people to know that there are actually over 180 different medications that can cause photosensitivity. Now, keep in mind that's not to say that every single one of the drugs on that list is guaranteed to do so. Some people may have, some people may have an experience with one while others may not. Um, but there are certain drug classes and even drugs within those classes that are considered to be more potent than others. So the most commonly reported medication classes are antimicrobials, and that's a broad swath of drugs that include antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, as well as NSAIDs, like your pain medications like ibuprofen and naproxen, and even certain cardiovascular medications. But in general, some of the most common drugs include the antibiotics ciprofloxacin, doxycycline, levofloxacin, tetracycline, and sulfamethoxazole, anticonvulsants like carbamazepine and lamotrigine, antidepressants like amitriptyline and sertraline, antifungals like voriconazole, antihistamines like cetirizine, diphenhydramine, and loratadine, better known as Zyrtec, Benadryl, and Claritin, antimalarials like hydroxychloroquine, antipsychotics like chlorpromazine, as well as those that are even used for vomiting like promethazine, blood pressure medications like nifedipine, many of the statins, a good example of that is atorvastatin, certain other cardiovascular medications like amiodarone and fenofibrate, sulfonylureas, which are used for diabetes, like glipizide and glyburide, diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide and furosemide. We also have oral contraceptives and estrogen products. NSAIDs, like I said before, which include ibuprofen and naproxen. And there's many other miscellaneous agents like chemotherapy agents, immunosuppressants, even rheumatologic medications like methotrexate, and topical skin products like coal tar. Now, interestingly, about the photosensitivity to coal tar is that it's actually more commonly seen in road workers and roofers since they handle tar compounds on a daily basis. Now, I understand that's a very lengthy and exhaustive list, but keep in mind, those are only the really, really common, those are only the ones that are considered to be like more potent. So those are just the tips of the iceberg, so to speak. For any listener interested, I would highly recommend that you check out the FDA's little blurb on this. They include they include like a very good list of examples, so we can include that in the show notes.
We definitely will. You bringing up a specific group of people that it's more commonly seen in, that just reminded me again, you deal with a very specific population when you're consulting with our partners and corrections. Do you get a lot of questions about the photosensitivity, photoallergy?
Yeah, so the photosensitivity one, definitely, just because like a lot of different medications can cause it, and a lot of times our facilities are located in a lot of the sunnier the sunnier states. They get a lot of time in the yard, so it's always something to keep in mind. That, and as well as general heat related questions regarding medications as well.
Yep. With photosensitivity reactions, how are they typically treated?
So in either type of reaction, the offending drug or chemical should be stopped whenever possible. Most phototoxic reactions can be treated as a sunburn. So obviously you're thinking cool compresses, ointments, and over-the-counter pain medications like ibuprofen and Tylenol, stuff like that. These things are typically sufficient. Now, photoallergic reactions, they need to be treated a little bit more like an allergic reaction. So you're thinking topical steroids like an over-the-counter hydrocortisone, in order to help reduce the inflammation. There are cases where in severe instances of photoallergic reaction where a patient may need to take 2 to 3 weeks of oral steroids in order to fully tamp down the allergic response. So in those cases, a healthcare provider would need to be sought, because obviously that's not something that you can get over the counter.
Right. It is important to note that not all people taking medications with a photosensitivity warning will develop a reaction. And even if you do develop a reaction one time, you aren't guaranteed to experience a second reaction later on. Are there any factors or predispositions that could help predict the likelihood of photosensitivity?
Yeah, so obviously your risk is going to be higher if you take more of those contributory medications that we had mentioned before, as well as if you spend more unprotected time out in the sun. But otherwise, no. Drug-induced photosensitivity isn't genetically inherited, so there is no known age, gender, or even racial predilection to developing this type of reaction.
Well, with all that in mind, then what are the measures that people could take to protect themselves from photosensitivity? I would imagine these are pretty common sense measures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everyone can kind of understand that there are two basic things in this equation, right? We have the medications and we have the sunlight. Now, unfortunately, it's not always easy to modify the specific medications that you or I or another person might be taking. So obviously, the easiest thing, the most modifiable thing in this equation is to protect yourself by reducing your sunlight exposure. So whenever you're outside, you want to be seeking shade, especially during those periods of high sun, typically around noon, like 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then if you are out in the sun, you want to limit your skin's sun exposure. And that can be by wearing the appropriate type of clothing, wearing long sleeves and pants to cover the most skin possible, as well as applying broad spectrum sunscreen regularly. I do want to remind our listeners that a sunscreen with an SPF of 30 or higher is recommended. But oddly enough, some sunscreen ingredients, like one that comes to mind is avobenzone, can actually cause photosensitivity in and of itself. But I will say that incidence is rare, so not something to get too highly worked up about.
Well, on a related note, I did want to ask you also about medications and heat-related illness, which includes both heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat exhaustion, of course, is when your body overheats, which can then lead to the more serious heat stroke, which is when your body not only overheats, but can no longer control temperature, possibly resulting in a dangerously high body temperature that could prove fatal.
Yeah, I think it's great that you bring this up because it's a great opportunity to highlight how to recognize the signs of heat-related illness. So, with heat exhaustion, a person may feel faint or dizzy, have excessive sweating. They may have cool, pale, or clammy skin. They may experience nausea or vomiting. They may have a rapid and weak pulse, and they may also be experiencing muscle cramps. So it's a lot more of like the overt physical symptoms you'd expect from being overheated, particularly that being the excessive sweating part. Now, heat stroke, on the other hand, has more of like something's wrong with the internal thermostat kind of feel to it. So, a patient with heat stroke may be experiencing a throbbing headache. A key thing to note is they will not be sweating in this case, despite having a body temperature above 103 degrees Fahrenheit and typically having red, hot, and dry skin. They may also be experiencing nausea or vomiting, but they will have a rapid, strong pulse. So with heat exhaustion, you have a rapid, weak pulse. Heat stroke, you have a rapid, strong pulse. And a patient with heat stroke may also lose consciousness. So these are important to distinguish because heat exhaustion can be managed at home. Typically, you get the person or yourself to a cooler place, provide water if they can drink it, and apply cool compresses or simply take a cool shower. Heat stroke, on the other hand, is actually a medical emergency and requires immediate attention in a hospital. So 911 should be called immediately.
And it's a good point to emphasize when you're talking about heat stroke that the patient would not be sweating. It's paradoxical, but that's just again that's showing the underlying thermostat is broken.
Yeah, it's your internal regulatory mechanisms are kind of broken at that point. And one of our biggest thermoregulatory mechanisms is sweating. You sweat to release, to basically release, or to cool the body down because the sweat evaporates and the evaporation is what cools the body down. So at that point, heat stroke is your inability to cool your own body down. So that's why you don't have any sweating occurring at that time.
Right. And also on top of that, though it's called heat stroke, this is not the same as a stroke.
It is poorly named.
Yeah.
I will give it that. Yeah, it's not a true neurological stroke where you would see, facial drooping and arm weakness and stuff like that. No, this is typically just a heat type of physical reaction to it.
Right. Well, there are several classes of medications that could either impair your body's heat regulation or they could decrease your awareness of heat-related illness, just that you're getting hotter. How does this happen? And what are, as with the toxicity discussion, what are the medications that have this risk?
Yeah, so it's obviously important to note that impaired thermoregulation by medications can obviously work both ways. So it can work, you can have an inability to compensate for cold and hot environments. But obviously, the inability to compensate for a hot environment is typically what we find to be the most detrimental, or at least is what is brought up most often in medical compendia. Either way, medications can impair the body's thermoregulation by a variety of mechanisms. These include interfering with the hypothalamus, which is your body's internal thermostat. So basically, they can change the settings or the number on your home's thermostat. They can also impede the thermoreceptors, so you don't feel the changes in ambient temperature, or they could reduce or accelerate sweat production. So a good example in the correctional setting are antipsychotics. So antipsychotics decrease the body's tolerance to heat. They lower the blood pressure, so they actually increase the risk of fainting in the heat. They also decrease sweating, so the body can't release as much internal heat. And they also cause confusion, lethargy, and decreased alertness in response to heat. So all of these mechanisms together is what make these medications a bit riskier in settings of extreme heat. But there are many medications that can impair heat regulation. So these include amphetamines like Adderall and Ritalin, anticholinergics like benztropine, antihistamines like Benadryl and Claritin, antipsychotics, as I mentioned, there's many of them, but two good examples are haloperidol and risperidone, beta blockers like carvedilol and metoprolol, calcium channel blockers like diltiazem and verapamil, diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide, laxatives like bisacodyl and senna, antidepressants like duloxetine, sertraline, and nortriptyline, thyroid medications when they're taken in higher doses than needed, like levothyroxine, and even some weight loss supplements like green tea extract. I think that's important to consider because a lot of time people don't consider the supplements that they're taking as having a potential negative impact.
Right.
Now, other drugs can simply decrease your awareness that you're too hot. Obviously, the first one that comes to mind is you think about alcohol. If you're consuming too much alcohol on a hot day, you're obviously not thinking, too much about the ambient temperature. So that simply just impairs your awareness that you're too hot. But we also see this with with medications like benzodiazepines, like Xanax and Ativan, as well as lithium. And then finally, it'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that many street drugs can also increase your risk of heat-related illness. And they do this by doing both things. They impair your ability to, it impairs the body's internal heat regulation while also decreasing awareness, of course. So these would include hallucinogenics like LSD or magic mushrooms, cocaine, stimulants like methamphetamine, as well as anabolic steroids, inhalants, and ecstasy. So there are a lot of different medications that can do this. So it's obviously important to always just double check, especially as, like you said, we're in the dog days of summer. So to kind of tie this all together, it's always important to have an up-to-date medication list, both for yourself as well as medical personnel. It's important for you to review your medications and bring it up with your provider, just to see, are any of these medications going to predispose me to photosensitivity or heat-related illness? It's always better to be proactive because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Couldn't have said it better, Chris. And I want to thank you for shedding some light, and that pun is absolutely intended, for shedding some light on this topic. I always enjoy the conversation and learning from you, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. So, Chris, looking forward to our next discussion, and in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your summer.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thanks a lot for all your thought-provoking questions. I appreciate that you're doing this, and I hope that everyone gets a lot out of it. So, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer as well. I'll be talking to you soon, I'm sure.
All right, definitely. Well, Chris, thank you again.
All right, take care.
This podcast features conversations with healthcare professionals. Their statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
PodcastRx is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services, the nation's largest correctional pharmacy provider. Catch our new episodes on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate the show and leave us a review. And if you have a topic you'd like to hear about on the show, or you'd like to share your thoughts on an episode, you can email us at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com.